platform. And now we're ready to begin today's event, and it starts off with a learning session on the principle of neutrality. This series forms a part of PHAP's online learning series on humanitarian law and policy. For those of you who are PHAP members and are participating in the association's Continuous Learning Credits program, please watch and listen for the numerical code afterwards, and I'll give you that so that you can use that code to access the assessment tool and earn your credit for the session. As you can see, we're 3/4 of the way through our series. We've already done humanity and impartiality, and now we are doing neutrality. Don't forget, though, that next Tuesday we do the 4th session, and that will be independence. So, the learning objectives for today. The first learning objective is understanding the core humanitarian principle of neutrality, both in its definition and in its implementation. The second learning objective would be to understand just knowledge of the examples of practical implications of neutrality when you're trying to operationalize it on the ground. Third, understanding the challenges involved in translating neutrality into assistance and protection work, such as public advocacy, and I know that's going to be a topic that's going to come up today. And then finally, familiarity with the differing interpretations of neutrality within the humanitarian community. So first, for the brief learning session, to help us accomplish these objectives, it's my great pleasure to introduce our guest expert for this presentation, Kate Mackintosh. Kate is a Deputy Registrar of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former, it's a lot easier to say ICTY, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. I want to be clear that Kate joins us today in her personal capacity and is not speaking in her official capacity as Deputy Registrar. Kate has 20 years of experience in international criminal justice and post-conflict interventions, as well as in the humanitarian policy and advocacy work. From 2003 to 2011, Kate worked with MSF, first as International Law Advisor and then Head of Humanitarian Affairs Department for the Operational Center in Amsterdam. And I should note that way back in the year 2000, Kate published an article called The Principles of Humanitarian Action in International Law, and it remains today to be one of the real seminal pieces on that issue, and that's why we've invited Kate here today. It's a great place to start the discussion on neutrality. Welcome, Kate, and over to you.
It's a great pleasure to be here. As you said, this is the third in the series of examinations of the fundamental principles of humanitarian action and the practical dilemmas around them. And today we're going to talk about neutrality. Now, I listened to Hugo Slim's wonderful talk on humanity, the first one in the session, just recently. And he mentioned that he was pleased to have been asked to discuss humanity because he said it was his favourite principle. Well, I think neutrality is actually my favourite principle, so I'm delighted to explore it with you here. It's my favourite because I believe it lies at the core of almost every dilemma facing humanitarian action today. I'll outline, and I got the cue mark briefly, what I think neutrality means as a principle of humanitarian action, and also a few of the key ways in which I think it's at stake for humanitarian actors today. We then have a great panel, and I'm also very much looking forward to interacting with, who will be able to take you right into the core of the current dilemmas that are facing humanitarianism. So, let's start with neutrality. Now, neutrality is, of course, one of the fundamental principles of the Red Cross movement. And these principles, as you will know, have also been adopted by the United Nations to cover its humanitarian work. And most humanitarian NGOs have also indicated their commitment to them. Just to put it into context, humanity is the fundamental principle. It's a belief in itself, and it explains the purpose, the motivation, and the rationale for humanitarian action. Impartiality operationalizes that principle of humanity. If every person is equally valuable, which is the core idea behind the principle of humanity, then they must be treated equally and in response to their individual needs. And that's where we get the principle of impartiality. Moving to neutrality, neutrality is a tool to make the first two possible. while humanity and impartiality focus on the individuals that are in need of assistance and protection, neutrality takes us into the context, at least the traditional context of humanitarian action, which is conflict. The concept of neutrality can only exist if there are two or more parties opposing each other. We're neutral not in regard to the victims, we're impartial in regard to the victims, we're neutral in regard to the conflict itself, or we're neutral between the parties to the conflict. So how is neutrality defined in the guiding texts? Aha, I see my slide has magically appeared. That was exactly the slide I was about to put up. Here we've got on the slide here, we've got the definition of neutrality as a fundamental principle of the Red Cross movement. I'll read it out. It's a short definition. It says that in order to continue to enjoy the confidence of all, the movement, the Red Cross movement, may not take sides in hostilities or engage at any time in controversies of a political, racial, religious, or ideological nature. So I'd like to pull out three different aspects of this, which are the three parts that I've highlighted in bold there on the slide. So the first line basically explains the function of the principle. The function or the purpose of neutrality is to enjoy the confidence of all. And why do we want to enjoy the confidence of all? Well, so they'll let us in. Neutrality is all about access. Access and, of course, security. We're neutral, we're not involved in the conflict, so allow us in and, importantly, don't shoot at us. Moving ahead, the definition then has two prongs. Neutrality means not taking sides in hostilities and not engaging in controversies of a political, racial, religious or ideological nature. I'll start with that second one, engaging in controversies, and we could call this ideological neutrality. I think ideological neutrality, or not engaging in controversies, raises the issues which probably first come to mind when we think about dilemmas over humanitarian neutrality, namely the question of whether speaking out about atrocities witnessed in the course of humanitarian work compromises neutrality, and the associated question, of course, of how far advocacy and humanitarian protection work are likely to be tolerated by authorities. I think there are at least two classic approaches to this question, which I hope will be explored more in the discussion, so I'll just outline them here. The first one holds that speaking out does compromise neutrality, and for that reason, neutrality, which, as we've seen, in any event is not a goal in itself, but a means to an end, neutrality should not be a core principle of humanitarian action. So in this view, neutrality can mean complicity. We cannot be neutral in the face of atrocities. We cannot be neutral in the face of violations against the civilian population, for example. Now, when the Code of Conduct for the Red Cross movement and NGOs involved in disaster relief was drawn up in the late 1990s, this was a prevailing view, or at least a very popular view, and you'll notice that the word neutrality does not appear in that code anywhere for exactly that reason. And I hope we have some participants here, perhaps some organisations that held that position, or maybe even hold that position today. An alternative understanding, which I believe would be advanced by the Red Cross, for example, is that the framework of international humanitarian law is neutral in itself. Its aim to protect civilians is purely humanitarian, and when that's carried out impartially, this is by definition a neutral act. So if we are to speak out in order to ensure or to encourage respect for international humanitarian law, that is inherently a neutral act. And there's a fantastic quote from Jean Pictet, with whom many of you will be familiar. Jean Pictet is the scholar, the man who wrote the commentary to the Geneva Conventions, and he's difficult to put on a PowerPoint slide, actually, because he talks in extremely long and elaborate sentences. But nonetheless, I will, in a minute, put up a slide, a short extract of something he said about ideological neutrality. And that's this. He says, neutrality characterises the reserve which the Red Cross must maintain with regard to any doctrine except its own. In other words, if the Red Cross stands up for its own principles, which includes, of course, the protection of civilians, protection of non-combatants, etc., that cannot be seen as a violation of neutrality. And I'll return to this idea that action which is in itself humanitarian and impartial must be neutral later on in my presentation. Okay, returning to the definition, let's look at the first prong of that definition. Neutrality is also defined as not taking sides in hostilities. What does this mean? It's fairly obvious that a humanitarian organisation will lose its neutrality if it takes up arms in a conflict. So what else can this principle contain? I think to put some meat on this bone, we can look at the Geneva Conventions themselves. Now, the term neutrality is actually not used at all in relation to humanitarian organisations in the Geneva Conventions. However, if you read the articles that relate to humanitarian action in the conventions, it is clear that the type of humanitarian action envisaged there does not and should not affect the balance of power between the parties. And this, I believe, is how we should understand this first prong of the definition. Not taking sides in hostilities. I think we can refer to this as practical neutrality, as opposed to the ideological neutrality we just discussed. John Pictet's commentary again spells out that humanitarian organisations should not engage in any hostile acts against one side. Now, apart from taking up arms, one can also think of perhaps passing information to one party that might be military significant, for example, about troop movements that humanitarian organisations may have noticed while they were working and travelling in the field. To pass on that information to another actor could be seen as a hostile act and would be a violation of practical neutrality. Conversely, humanitarian operations should not have the effect of advantaging the military efforts or, interestingly, the economy of the party in whose territory they operate, and this appears in Geneva Convention number 4. This, I think, is interesting for organisations who bring valuable resources into a conflict zone, as many of us do, and it clearly brings up the issue of diversion by warring parties and the importance for humanitarian organisations of ensuring they exercise effective control over the resources brought into a conflict area. If resources are diverted and end up supporting military efforts or significantly advantaging the economy, that humanitarian operation is not neutral, and crucially, that means that the party in control of that territory is not obliged to permit access. So if we understand the prohibition on taking sides in hostilities in this broad way, I think, like many of these humanitarian principles, it makes instinctive sense. We understand that if we violate this kind of practical neutrality, we're likely to be denied access, or even to put ourselves physically at risk. We will have lost our privileged position as neutral actors, and we will in some sense have entered the conflict. I said I'd return to the idea discussed in terms of advocacy earlier. The action which is humanitarian and impartial is by definition neutral. I think this is a powerful and important idea, and it's supported by the World Court, the International Court of Justice, which, as most of you know, was established as part of the United Nations after World War II. And I'll hope you'll allow me just to discuss one judgment of the World Court, which is relevant here. So the International Court of Justice had a chance to pronounce itself on humanitarian principles and the definition of humanitarian assistance just over 30 years ago, in 1984, when the United States, which was at that time involved in a proxy war against Nicaragua, was called to the court by Nicaragua, who complained about a number of things, including the US funding of the armed opposition group in its territory at that time, the Contras. Now, Nicaragua alleged that the US was attacking it, or at least taking sides in hostilities against it. Look at the definition of neutrality for a humanitarian organisation. So Nicaragua alleged that the United States was taking sides in hostilities, at the very least, by funding, training and arming the Contra group. Now, what's interesting for us is the US defence. The US said, we're not taking sides in hostilities, we're providing humanitarian assistance. So the court had to examine whether the assistance which was being provided fit into the Red Cross definition of humanitarian and impartial in In other words, whether it fit the definition of being provided for the purposes of alleviating suffering and saving lives, and whether it was delivered in an impartial manner. They found that the assistance did not fit the definition, and therefore that the US had intervened illegally in the affairs of Nicaragua, that the acts of the US had not been neutral. Now, what's interesting for us is that they confirmed then that if that action had been humanitarian and impartial, it would, by definition, have been neutral. It would not have been seen as taking sides in the conflict. Remember that. I'd now like to just briefly introduce some contemporary dilemmas in the area of neutrality, and I'll just outline them. I'm hoping that many of you will have interesting current dilemmas and variations on these themes that we can discuss with the panel. But I'll just look at two, perhaps could be described as global trends, which have been going on for some time, but which continue to affect humanitarian organisations, and where neutrality is, I think, the critical issue at stake. The first one is the continuing trend to include humanitarian action as part of a coherent, joined-up response to conflict, which may also involve political, military, peacekeeping and development actions. This has been seen in settings around the world and in the doctrines of most of the major Western powers, whether identified as COIN or counterinsurgency strategy, the 3D or comprehensive approach, or even the integrated missions of the UN. The linking of humanitarian assistance to security goals has provoked suspicion about the neutral identity of the humanitarian sector. Now, we've seen some dramatic assertions of this point of view and perhaps even some consequences of this idea. As you heard at the outset, I used to work for Médecins Sans Frontières, and after 5 Médecins Sans Frontières staff were killed in Afghanistan back in 2004, a spokesman for the Taliban, whose involvement in the attack, by the way, was never established, nonetheless claimed responsibility for the murders and later stated that organisations, I'm quoting, like MSF, work for American interests. They're therefore targets and they would be at risk of further attacks. In a move which left hundreds of thousands of people without emergency assistance, as you know, Al-Shabaab expelled 16 humanitarian organisations from south-central Somalia in November 2011, only 4 months after famine was declared. An Al-Shabaab spokesman accused the organisations of, among other things, lacking complete detachment and neutrality with regard to the conflicting parties in Somalia. And 2 years later, an Al-Shabaab official was reported as saying, whether they call themselves humanitarian or not, we know who they are. They're the civilian face of the infidel forces. There are other examples. The point is the statements. There was a clear link between the actions of humanitarian organisations and Western intervention, and it seems fairly clear that this, to a certain extent at least, was caused by Western powers themselves using humanitarian action as part of their response to conflict overseas. So this perception that humanitarian organisations strayed beyond the framework of humanitarian action, lost their neutrality, broke the contract between warring parties and humanitarian organisations, is a worrying development, and one I think which continues to challenge humanitarian organisations in the field today. The second factor I wanted to touch upon, just briefly, where humanitarian neutrality is at stake, is counterterrorism. Now, as many of you are aware, humanitarian operations in parts of the world where armed groups have been designated as terrorist are often hampered by laws aimed at preventing the financing of terrorist organisations. Now, if humanitarian resources were financing the military efforts of a warring party, designated terrorist or not, this would clearly be a violation of the practical neutrality that we've been discussing. And organisations have of their own accord introduced a range of internal control mechanisms to minimise risks of diversion, not only in these contexts, of course, but in any context, because the last thing a humanitarian organisation wants its precious and crucial resources to do is to be diverted from the people that actually need them, and to fuel the conflict by prolonging the war and financing. In the counterterrorism framework, however, and in some more extreme cases, there are suggestions that humanitarian assistance itself to individuals associated with groups designated as terrorists should be prohibited. In other words, assistance to individuals designated terrorists would be a violation of neutrality. Just want to raise this because I think it's a very dangerous suggestion. And here I would like to bring up again the point I made earlier, which I think we say is supported by the International Court of Justice. In other words, if aid is humanitarian and impartial, it cannot be seen as support to a party to the conflict, terrorist or otherwise, and it is, by definition, neutral. I think this equation is crucial in defending humanitarian assistance and protection in the face of assaults on the legitimacy of humanitarian operations today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you very much for that. It was a very clear presentation, and I think we've all learned quite a bit about neutrality, both in terms of what it really means, and I like the way you've broken, but also just the way it plays out in a couple of very, very difficult dilemmas that we in the humanitarian business are facing these days. Before we move on, we did receive some questions beforehand, and I want to ask you one because I think it's just kind of a point of clarification. Azra Durek has asked, it's not always possible to be neutral. And do you have guidelines? Are there actually guidelines for when there are exceptions to neutrality?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think neutrality, like most of the going to be contested and somewhat exercise. I highlighted the two aspects where this might come up. One is the ideological neutrality, and I think there are probably always discussions about whether taking a position for or against a party to the conflict in some way fits within the framework of neutrality. And as I said, there are different views on that. I believe the Red Cross view and the would support is that where is to protect the framework, then it's still neutral. Practically, however, though, it may still have negatives, and it may be perceived as not being neutral. In terms of the other aspect, the more I don't, but I think it's very interesting. I think that's something organisations really do have to take seriously, and I believe most humanitarian organisations do. And diversion is an absolutely legitimate concern of warring parties, and one which allows them to deny access to humanitarian organisations. So humanitarian organisations have to develop robust internal, risk management systems which enable them to have and to show that they have good control over their resources. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah.
Suggesting a guideline.
That's a really important point. But just to be clear, do you view neutrality more as kind of a sliding scale, white yes or no thing? It's more to what degree is an organization neutral and working towards neutrality?
I think that's right. I think humanitarian organisations should try to avoid being caught up in conflict in any way, but they will be challenged, acts will be challenged as not being neutral anyway. So there should be an ongoing discussion about these issues. Okay,
two more points of clarification. We've heard in the discussion around humanity that even a military actor can act with humanity and can act with impartiality. Can militaries act with neutrality?
That's a great question. I guess it depends what kind of military. Are we talking about like a third military who's not involved in the conflict?
I guess I was thinking of parties to the conflict. Would they ever be able to act neutrally?
I don't think that would be a relevant concept for the parties to the conflict, no. I think it's really about an outside actor coming in and having absolutely no impact on the conflict. That would be the goal, to come in as a third party, have no impact. That's how you get in, that's how you would negotiate your access, that's how you would claim legitimacy. So I think it's really relevant to external parties.
Yeah, and there you're speaking, for instance, of peacekeepers.
Yeah, also.
Okay. Maybe one last point for clarification. You did mention that neutrality is a concept that's relevant in armed conflict. What about other places where humanitarians might be working, for instance, in a natural disaster situation?
Yeah, that's very interesting. I would consider that neutrality is only relevant, it's a common sense point really, where there is a conflict, because as I said, you are neutral between two opposing parties. That's what the word means, right? Or between 2 points of view. However, just for accuracy's sake, I should maybe point out that the United Nations, the resolution, the 1991 resolution, which adopted the fundamental principles for all the humanitarian work of the United Nations, doesn't specify that that would only apply in armed conflict. And I suppose we can think of a polarized situation which might fall short of armed conflict when it would still be important, for example, perhaps in situations of gang violence or other sub-armed conflict situations where it would still be important not to be strongly associated with any particular party in the situation.
Okay, thank you for that. And I think what we should do now is move on to the next stage of this afternoon or morning or evening, depending on where you are. But basically, look, for those of you who are part of PHAP's series of online learning sessions on humanitarian law and policy, you're able to take part in a two-part assessment for your continuous learning credits. And once the assessments are live, you'll be notified via email. And here's the assessment code. It's 1389. Please note this down. In order to complete these assessments, you're going to need this code, 1389.